Alright, so UVs. UVs are basically a way of displaying a 3D model in 2D space. So I'll just show you. So like think of if you have like a globe, right? It's a circular object, like the Earth is clearly round. If you took that globe, like these people apparently did, and literally just smashed it, you now have basically a 2D representation of the Earth. This is actually kind of like the exploded globe is actually kind of an interesting example. But yeah, so I mean, this is basically like the Earth represented as 2D. Theoretically, if you were to refold this and like tape it back together, you would have a functional globe again. You would have an actual 3D sphere with a globe texture on it. Another example, like this model I made a while ago. Like here's an example for what the UVs for like a face might look like. So in this case, like I have this like creepy, super creepy face that I made. If I just look at the color channel of this face, so you'll see this is basically how I represented this face in 2D space. So I basically think of if you had like a rubber mask and you just like sort of cut slits in it until it lays flat on the ground. That's basically what I did for these UVs. And then you can see, so like if I mouse over, you can see it all sort of show like here's, you know, where the eye is and here's where all this stuff is. And I just took this into, I think I textured this originally in Mudbox. But you can add textures like in Photoshop or Mudbox or ZBrush or like whatever. There's a bunch of different programs you can use to texture stuff. Substance Painter is really good if you're actually into texturing for more than just necessity. Like if you just like doing texturing, I would actually recommend investing in Substance Painter because it's a really great program. But yeah, so I mean, this is basically this face as if it were flattened onto a little 2D image plane. So when you are doing UVs in Maya, so I'll just make a cube. So the first thing you want to be aware of is that pretty much every shape that you make in Maya starts with default UVs. So right now I just have my nice cube. I'm going to open my UV texture editor. And I can do that either here in the Poly Modeling tab. There's like this weird sort of little icon for it. You can also go to Windows, Modeling Editors, UV Editor, and pull it up from there. So it'll open these two, and they've revamped the ever-living crap out of the UV system in Maya 2018. They made some of the menus, in my opinion, much more annoying, but they also added some features that make things really nice. But anywho, so you can just ignore the toolkit for now. So you'll notice here's my square. Here is how it's choosing to represent that square in 2D. So really quick, it's basically just, like if I can select a face here, it'll show me which one the face is in the UV editor. I can click a face in the UV editor, and it'll show me which one it is in the viewport, etc. And the same goes for vertices. It'll highlight, if you select it in the UV editor, it'll highlight it in viewport, etc., etc. Edges work the same way. So one thing to be aware of is if you take a vertex here and you modify it and drag it around, it's not going to change your UVs, and at some point you will need to come back and modify that, basically. And same thing for edges and faces, etc. And I'll go into this a little bit more on like when the actual like UV demo videos, but yeah, so like you can do certain things to your geometry. Like I can insert edge loops, and that won't really hurt my UVs. You can see it'll just add in more lines down here. Things that you 100% should not do if you want to keep your UVs the same are like grab a face and extrude said face, or like append something, like fill a hole with an append polygon tool. You'll definitely need to modify your UVs to compensate for that, or else it's going to make your texture look terrible. Anywho, so once you pull up your UV editor, you'll notice that when I select my object, it displays like all of these little white lines. Those are the seams, or like where the cuts are in your UV edges, or in your UV editor. So like you'll notice like these edges are connected in your UV editor, so if you have a texture, it'll wrap seamlessly around them. These edges here are cut. You can see this one would join to this edge here if you wanted to like fold the box back up. So there would totally be a seam there if you added a texture to your object. So a lot of times to test the UVs, I'll just, or like to get a visual representation of them, I'll just assign a new random Lambert, call it UVs, and then I'll just map. I have on my desktop a UV checker texture that I use for like legitimately everything. I just grabbed this off Google. I just happen to like this one. So I'll hit 6 to make sure that texture actually displays. And you'll notice that, for the most part, it looks pretty reasonable. The seams happen to be laid out really nicely along these lines. So it actually makes like a pretty reasonable looking box. The UVs are like a little weird for a square. You might need to modify them depending on what you do. But so like I said before, any object that you create in Maya is going to have default UVs with it. So for the most part, I find like, I don't know, I always end up modifying the square UVs just depending on like where I need my seams. Like a lot of times for me, I think it makes more sense to, and I'll show you how I'm modifying this shortly, but like I for some reason always think it makes more sense to like have one side of your cube with no seams on it. Like if this is going to be the front of my object, I can just have like a nice sort of more seamless look. I don't know. It's really personal preference with cubes. There's no great way to UV a cube in my opinion. So just assign this my UV texture. And then I found for the most part, like the UVs for spheres are like pretty good-ish, mostly. It just takes up like the whole UV plane and sort of hangs out. The worst part about these is like these little top caps here. It's like you just have a bunch of cuts up here. So if you were to make these, you'll notice right now that there's a bunch of stretching. So like if I look in the middle of this texture, the texture I've applied is just a grid. Like these are square, and you'll notice that here they are very much not square. It's more of a rectangle, and then they get more distorted the more you go down. So if I were to make these UVs perhaps more of like a real shape, or a shape more similar with less stretching, I could theoretically unfold this. And then at least one side of this, like this side here, is going to have a slightly more uniform texture. And again, I'll go into how to modify this, the UVs a little bit more specifically. I'm just sort of trying to do a basic overview of what they actually are a little bit right now. Let's see. So I'll go through a few more objects. So I find that actually the torus usually has pretty darn nice UVs. It just takes up like the entire grid. There's just one little hidden seam in the middle and one seam along the outside, and it's just a nice looking UV object. I mean, there's still distortion, but it's a very efficient, well laid out set of UVs. If I wanted to maybe make these a little bit more square, I could shrink this down and just take the whole UV area and scale it. Which actually leads me into I guess some of the ideals with UVing. So again, ideally you would have, if you have a UV checker texture on your object, the ideal would be to have all of these squares be as close to square as possible, and as uniform in size as possible. And what I mean by that is if I just did this. So what you usually don't want to see, unless you have a very specific reason for doing this, is like you don't want to see half of your model have a super tiny grid size on it, and then the other half have a much larger grid size. And again, I've totally fudged this before, and like depending on my needs, I will modify this. But generally, it's good to have uniform UVs throughout your whole object, unless you have a very specific reason for not doing that. And then the other goal would be to have as few seams in your UVs as possible, especially if you are smoothing your object like with the 3 key. The seams usually become a little bit more visible. Sometimes I'll have some pulling on them. So like what you wouldn't necessarily want to do is like, you know, make a bunch of cuts in your UVs like this. Like if I went in and just like cut this, and then I would just do, again, I'll explain all these tools in a sec, but if I like broke up my UVs like really crazily like this, you can see that there's like a bunch of seams now where the colors are, which isn't necessarily something that I would want, because it just makes it harder to texture. Like if you just apply, you know, a wood grain or something like that to this, you're going to see all of these seams. So for the most part, the fewer seams, the better. But it is impossible to map an object without having some kind of seam somewhere. You just need to kind of look at your object, look at the way it's being displayed, and decide where the best place for a seam is. Like if I'm looking at the outside of this object, you probably don't want to put a seam straight through the outside. You know, hiding it on the inside was a pretty solid plan. On the other hand, if you're looking at the inside of your object like this, and this is going to be kind of the view that you're rendering from, it might make more sense to fill the seam in here and then put a new seam and keep the seam on the outside. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's kind of, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense as like what a UV is. It's basically just a way of representing this 3D image, or this 3D model, in a 2D space so that you can texture the whole thing, effectively see the whole thing at once. And you can then go into like something like Photoshop or another program and draw textures on. The other thing I should mention is, for the most part, it is good to keep your UVs from overlapping each other. So like, right now I have this piece of the UV, it's called a UV shell, and it's overlapping another part of your texture. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is not good. If you just have a random like texture on your model, like a wood grain or like a noise grain or something where it doesn't matter if you reuse part of the texture, it's not a problem. If I had something where I needed to put, like for this face, I wouldn't want, you know, say the ear texture overlapping the part where the eye was, because then I'm going to have to basically choose, do I want the ear to have eye texture on it, or do I want the eye to have ear texture on it? So if you need something where you have like very different textures on this, like in this case, you know, I have like some shading around the eye, and then I have very specific shading around the ear, that's an instance where you would definitely not want to overlap UVs. With something like this hair here, I would totally overlap UVs because it's just sort of an indiscriminate texture, and it really doesn't particularly matter like where. It's all just using a different part of the hair. I just want a little variation in the hair. So like I could have, you know, a bunch of UVs overlapping just to use different chunks of the hair, without needing 8 different textures. To a certain extent, it's the same thing a little bit with the coat down here. So for this like sort of just grainy texture, I wouldn't necessarily care if my UVs were overlapped. Sometimes, depending on what you need. But obviously, like this sort of elastic band here is a different texture from this, so I would want that to be a separate space in the UV plane so I can actually make that separate texture like I've done here. So hopefully that makes more sense. I'll go into that a little bit more later. But yeah.